So not all my brain cells are completely woken up yet, but I'm sure they will by the time we end. Anyway, so as we know, we interact with our environment, with each other, with ourselves, through three gateways, the gateways of our body, speech, and mind. So our physical actions and our verbal actions, and most especially our mental actions, which support the other two, which are the source of the other two, those actions, those activities can either be beneficial, constructive, helpful, virtuous, or they can be quite the opposite. They can be harmful. So just for example, taking the actions of speech, the verbal actions, the things that we say can be done with a very positive motivation, with a desire to be helpful, to desire to be truthful. And these leave in their wake the instincts for happiness, for well-being. On the other hand, if our motivation is not clear, if it's muddy, if it's confused, or if it's harmful, then our actions of speech can be quite destructive. And we see that played out not only in our own individual lives, but on a global scale as well, that the things that people say, even while sitting by themselves, can have a disastrous effect on hundreds, thousands, even millions of people. So what we are trying to do by engaging in this practice is getting closer to our underlying nature of compassion and loving kindness and wisdom. Or in other words, we're trying to uncover or get in deeper contact with our own Buddha nature, our own potential to experience the same enlightenment as Guru Shakyamuni Buddha. Now, those actions of body, speech, and mind that we do, let's focus on the negative or destructive actions, because those are the ones that we want to purify. There's no need to purify our loving, kind, compassionate actions, because they lead to the happiness that we all desire. It's the ones that would lead to suffering in one form or another that need cleansing. Right? But we could say that not all negative actions are created equal. There are different factors that make negative, destructive actions either more or less heavy, less harmful. So for example, going back to the action of speech, telling a white lie with very little motivation to be harmful, well, negative, well, leading to an unhappy result, is not nearly as heavy as the kind of lies which involve the suffering of many, many people, and that's done with a very heavy, non-virtuous action, motivation. Okay, so in the teachings on karma, since all of this is about purifying negative karma just meaning the actions of the intentional actions of body, speech, and mind that we engage in. So when we're talking about purifying karma, we have to keep in mind that there are various factors, as I mentioned, that make those actions either heavier, in other words, producing more suffering, or lighter, producing less suffering. And these four opponent powers that we have, the reason that they work, the reason that they're so helpful, so effective, is that these four are directly related to the factors that make our negative actions less heavy. Okay, so this is not the time or the place to go into an extensive teaching on karma, but it's enough to just go over some of the points that make karma lighter or heavier, and then to see how these four opponent powers are actually opponents, how they help us extricate ourselves from the suffering that would be produced by the negative actions. Okay. So one of the attitudes of mind that make a negative action heavier is when we rejoice in it. For example, again, thinking back many years to my college days, sometimes in our dormitory we would get into this what we called was ranking people out. In other words, it's a way of continually insulting the other person. Sometimes it was done as a joke, but very often it turned serious. So ranking people out. And sometimes what happened was that, sometimes you think of a good rejoinder, but it comes too late, so you can't use it. But on some occasions, the rejoinder comes right away, and there's a certain pride in being able to say the perfect insult right at that time. So not only do you insult the other person, right, but you rejoice in having done it. So this attitude of rejoicing in something which is in fact negative or destructive increases the heaviness of a negative action. The opposite is true, however. If when we do or say something that is negative, harmful in one way or another, and then afterwards say, oh, I shouldn't have done that. That wasn't good. In other words, instead of rejoicing in it, we cultivate a certain sense of regret towards it. That automatically lessens the heaviness of that negative action, right? So these four opponent powers, starting with regret, aren't just magic things that we do that suddenly erase karma. They're directly related to what makes karma heavier or lighter, beginning with this attitude of generating some feeling of regret for any harm that we may have done. Okay, and so that's presented in the very first of the four opponent powers, regret. It's actually a simple acknowledgement that something that we did was in fact harmful. Now, back in college, when we were in the game of insulting each other, supposedly as a joke, but sometimes becomes much more serious than that. At that time, making those so-called jokes, giving those insults, ranking the other person out, isn't viewed as a harmful action. It's viewed as being clever, right? But let's say we say something in jest, and we notice the other person doesn't take it as a joke. The other person takes it seriously. What happens then? I think for most people, especially if they don't really have malice in their mind, right? They just got into this verbal way of speaking out of habit, then there's a sense, oh, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to hurt your feelings. I was just trying to be clever, right? So that attitude of regret arises spontaneously, doesn't it? When we accidentally hurt the feeling of someone else, someone that we like. So here we start the purification practice by cultivating this attitude of regret. And of course, there's a lot that can be said to differentiate regret, which in this case is very helpful, it's very positive. It lessens the strength of a negative action, from guilt. Guilt being the attitude which just traps us. I'm such a bad person. So one of the main differences is regret we recognize that an action was incorrect, was harmful. Guilt is we start identifying it with the sense of I am a bad person, like that. And some of you have heard this before, but when the differentiation between regret and guilt, when that question was brought up to His Holiness the Dalai Lama, he very succinctly said, regret is an attitude that aims towards the future, whereas guilt keeps us trapped in the past. And I thought that was a very succinct, very accurate, and very telling way of differentiating between an attitude which can be helpful because it's helping us extricate ourselves from negativity, to one that just keeps us further and further trapped into it. Okay. Now, another factor which makes our whatever negative actions we may have done either heavier or lighter has to do with the presence or the absence of a good motivation, of a positive state of mind, right? So, for example, okay, let's go back to the same example again. We can say something with a motivation to hurt somebody else's feelings, or we could say something out of habit or jest which accidentally hurts another person's feeling. So to differentiate those two, the first one was done with malice aforethought. We wanted to hurt the other person's feelings. We wanted to kind of turn in the knife, stick in the knife and turn it like that. The second one was, in a sense, an accident, right? Okay. So in the first one, we definitely had the motivation to harm. So there's a presence of a negative motivation, a harmful motivation. But the second one, that motivation either wasn't there or was very, very faint, right? So whether an action is done with a positive intention to harm or without that intention to harm makes a big difference as to how harmful that action was, karmically speaking. In other words, the effect it will have on us as the person who engaged in that action. So the second opponent power has to do with the cultivation of refuge and bodhicitta. So refuge, turning to the three jewels of refuge, following the Dharma, right? And bodhicitta, the cultivation of the compassionate attitude, wishing to attain enlightenment for the benefit of others. Those two are extremely positive, powerful motivations for the good. So if we do an action, let's say a negative action, but the motivation is ameliorated, is softened by the presence of the mind of refuge and bodhicitta. Sometimes we can't do it at the time of the action, but afterwards, looking back on it with regret, we can bring in those attitudes of refuge and bodhicitta. Then this greatly reduces the strength of that karmic consequence of that action. So the second opponent power, a reliance, which we'll talk about more in a moment. The reason it's an opponent power is because when these positive minds are present, they overshadow whatever negative mind may have been present at the time of committing that action. Okay. And then finally, no, not finally, third, almost finally, is the power of the remedy, the remedial action we do. And in the teachings of the Dharma, in the Lamrim teachings, for example, there's a very, very long list of the kinds of remedial actions that we might engage in. Once we've noticed we've done something incorrect or harmful, then there are things that we can do about it. We're not stuck in that. We can engage in a remedial activity, a remedy. And some of the remedies are quite common sense in a way. In other words, if we said something harsh to someone, and especially if they took it seriously and hurt their feelings, then one remedial action is to say something pleasant, something nice, something helpful to that person. We can start with a simply, oh, I'm sorry, that didn't come out the way I really meant it. And then we say something nice that softens the negative action, it softens the effect of it, and therefore helps us decrease whatever negative consequences we might experience from having done such an unskillful action. So sometimes the remedy to a negativity is simply to do its opposite. So if we've done something out of greed that was harmful, then we can do something out of generosity to remedy that action. Right? I think in the past I've used the example from the film Gandhi, in which he is confronted by a man who's just been involved in this terrible violence that overtook Calcutta. And during that violence, he killed another child. He himself was a Muslim and he killed a Hindu child. And so now he told Gandhi, I'm going to hell. And Gandhi says, I know a way out of hell. And he says, in this conflagration in Calcutta that we've just had, many children have been orphaned. Find a young Hindu child who has been orphaned and adopt him. Take him up as your own. But remember, raise him as a Hindu. So he offered a way to undo or unbalance the negative action he did of killing a Hindu child by raising a Hindu child, adopting him, protecting him, and bringing him up. And so that's you don't find that remedy written anywhere in the Dharma teachings. Go out and adopt a person from another religion. But in terms of the action of what took place in Calcutta on those occasions, that was a very powerful, extremely powerful, skillful way of undoing the karmic effect of an action which was, very powerful. But within the teachings of the Dharma, there are certain practices which are specifically designed for purification. And I think many of you, I wouldn't be surprised if it wasn't all of you, are familiar with the practice of Vajrasattva purification. In fact, when I took my first course in Nepal from Lama Yeshe and Khebche Zopa Rinpoche, the habit then, and I think it's continued in the years since then, is that once the course was over, in which there was a survey of the entire Lamrim with retreats and meditations, once it was over, it was recommended that people do a Vajrasattva retreat. Having seen what negative actions were, having recognized them, then to purify them. And so that was one of the main recommendations, was to do Vajrasattva purification. And those of you who are familiar with Vajrasattva purification will recognize all the main elements of that practice here in this practice. The main difference being that in this practice, the figure that we're focusing our attention on is Guru Shakyamuni Buddha, the historical Buddha, and I'll have more to say about that. Whereas in Vajrasattva, our attention is focused on the meditational deity, Vajrasattva, who in his white color and various ornaments and so forth is a manifestation of purity. Okay. Now, a question may arise if this practice and the practice of Vajrasattva is very, very similar, as in some respects, identical, then, and if Vajrasattva is the kind of main recommended practice of purification, among others, it's not the only one, then why are we doing this practice with Guru Shakyamuni Buddha? You know, if one practice already exists with Vajrasattva, then why are we doing this one? Well, I have a couple of reasons. One is, the more familiar we are with this practice, then if we ever go back to or ahead to doing the Vajrasattva practice, we'll already understand all its main elements. So anything that we learn in relation to this practice would be applicable to Vajrasattva, should we do Vajrasattva sometime in the future. But there's another reason, and that is doing a tantric practice, you know, practice with the meditational deities such as Vajrasattva, Chenresig, Haruka, Yamantaka, and so forth. Those practices often have two aspects to them. One is seeing the invoking that meditational deity who represents whatever practice, whatever quality we're trying to cultivate, compassion, purification, wisdom, whatever it might be, right? And to do what's known as a front generation of that figure. So let's say we learn what Tara, the female Buddha of compassion, looks like in a particular practice, and then as the practice unfolds, we invoke that figure in front of us. Not always in front. It's called front generation, but it could be in front of us. It could be on the top of our head. It could be in our heart, like that. And generally speaking, for most of the practices, certainly in the lower levels of Tantra, that's kosher. That's okay. There's no difficulty in visualizing the front generation, whether we've received an initiation or not, an empowerment or not. Right? But the other kind of generation is called self-generation, in which we give up our ordinary limited vision of ourself, and we ourselves arise as the meditational deity. And the general instruction is that in order to do that, in order to see oneself as Tara or Chenresig or Vajrasattva or Haruka or Yamantak or any of these other figures, we can only do that on the basis of having received an empowerment ceremony or an initiation. It's a practice we are given directly in a shared meditation between ourselves and the guru who presents that practice to us. So without that, it's not considered kosher. It's not considered actually correct to do the self-generation. Okay. So you see the difference between that. We can, like, I remember having a chance many, many years ago to have an audience with His Holiness, and I asked about practices which I know myself and many other people were interested, such as specifically Tara and Chenresig. And I asked, is it all right to share the practice of Tara and Chenresig with people who have not received initiation into those practices? And his answer was, well, if you do that with the motivation of being helpful to the other person, then there's no harm at all, as long as we're talking about the front generation. In other words, you can invoke that figure and receive the inspiration from inviting Tara or Chenresig into our meditational space, and then do the practice based on that. Right? That's fine. Our motivation is to be helpful. It doesn't require an initiation to do that level of practice for that level of meditational deity. But such an initiation, such an empowerment is absolutely necessary if we're going to do the front generation practice. Okay. Then on one occasion, a number of years later, I was meeting, actually one of the only private meetings I had with one of the Dalai Lama's tutors, Kirti Tsenchab Rinpoche in Dharamsala. And I had a question for him that I never felt I knew the answer to. And that was, whenever Lama Yeshe and Lama Zopa or other teachers would talk about different practices, whenever they talked about a practice focusing on the Buddha, Guru Shakyamuni Buddha, very often that practice had as an essential part of it that at the end of the practice, we ourselves arose as the Buddha. In other words, we were doing a self-generation as Shakyamuni Buddha. And I didn't understand why it wasn't proper to do that with certain deities, such as Chenresig and Tara and Yamantak and so forth, whereas it was fine. There was no problem doing it in relationship to the Buddha, Shakyamuni Buddha, right? Did that question ever arise in any of your minds, why it was okay to do it with Buddha and not with the other figures? Anyway, it arose in my mind, and I had this occasion to ask the question, which I never thought to formulate, and I never had a chance to ask before that. And he said, the reason for that is that a practice based on visualizing Guru Shakyamuni Buddha is not actually a tantric practice, even though it has many elements in common with the practice of Tantra, as clearly evident by the similarity between the Vajrasattva practice and the practice that we're doing, or about to do if I stop speaking long enough to actually get into the practice. He said, what we're doing when we visualize ourselves as Guru Shakyamuni Buddha is cultivating the wish to be able to generate those qualities in ourselves. It's an aspiration. It's not a self-generation. It's envisioning or imagining the result that we want to attain. We want to be like Shakyamuni Buddha. So what does that mean? It doesn't mean we want to have long earlobes, because Shakyamuni Buddha is always represented with long earlobes. That's not what it means to be like Shakyamuni Buddha. It doesn't mean that we want golden skin and all of those things, right? Those things that are related to the common visualization of Shakyamuni Buddha. He says, what it means is that we admire the qualities of loving kindness, compassion, wisdom, and skillful means, and we wish to develop those qualities to make our own life more meaningful and fulfilling, and most especially to be beneficial to others. So seeing ourselves as Shakyamuni Buddha is just an expression of our compassionate wish to attain enlightenment for the sake of others. It's the representative of a wish, an intention. It's not, in the strictest sense of the word, a self-generation, even though we are giving up to as much as we can our ordinary limited sense of self and taking on the identity of the Buddha. But it isn't a self-generation in the complete sense of the word. And also, we don't need an empowerment to cultivate that wish, for the simple reason that we already possess the Buddha nature. It's not something that we have to receive in an empowerment ceremony from a teacher, right? We already have the potential for full enlightenment, which is another way of expressing what it means to have Buddha nature, that all beings have this. There's a text by Maitreya, the Peerless Continuum, or the Uttara Tantra, in which it gives a bunch of similes, I think 9, if I remember correctly, 9 similes for what it means for ordinary beings like ourselves to have the Buddha nature, to have this extraordinary potential within us. And one of the examples that's given is that we're like a poor person who doesn't realize that buried under the floorboards of his house lies an extraordinary treasure. He doesn't realize it's there. So he thinks of himself, I have to catch myself, they think of themselves as poor because they don't realize they possess this treasure, right? In a similar fashion, all sentient beings think that they are poor in terms of qualities that they don't recognize they have. But in fact, they all have, in the deepest aspect of their being, the potential for full enlightenment. It's already present. It's just a matter of uncovering it, right? Bringing it to the surface. So for this reason, when we visualize ourselves as Shakyamuni Buddha, we're doing it on the basis, to whatever extent we've generated this thought and have cultivated the understanding about Buddha nature, we're doing it on the basis that we already have that potential within us. It's not something that we have to newly receive from anyone else, from our guru or from anyone else. We're just recognizing this. So for that reason, this practice can be done with Shakyamuni Buddha, with visualizing oneself as Shakyamuni Buddha. At the end of it, can be done by anyone who has the Buddha nature, and that means by anyone. So all beings, even insects, have the Buddha nature. If we have a mind, the mind has the potential to be enlightened. Okay. So that was the reason. My explanation was much longer and more complex than Kirti Tsenchab's explanation, but it came down to the same point, that in this practice of Shakyamuni Buddha, we don't need the empowerment because we have what is necessary to imagine ourselves in terms of let's say, a wish fulfillment, fulfilling the wish that we could generate this enlightened vision of ourselves based on our Buddha potential, our Buddha nature. It occurs to me that I may have just explained something that I might be the only one who had a question about it. Maybe everybody else I'm speaking to says, oh, sure, I can visualize myself as Shakyamuni Buddha, no problem. But I always wondered, why can you do that for one and not for all the other tantric deities? And the reason was, this isn't actually a tantric transformational practice. It's a practice based on something, on uncovering something we already have within us. Okay. Okay, so that was about the third one, the remedy, the opponent power of the remedy, the different practices we might do, whether it's Vajrasattva or Shakyamuni Buddha, or a whole host of other ones. For instance, if the action that we did was mainly physical, we did harm with our body, then one practice, which is very often recommended to purify negative actions of the body, is the practice of prostrations, where while verbally reciting a certain prayer or mantra and mentally generating the wish to be purified of those negative actions, physically we actually engage in the practice of bending down overcoming our pride and arrogance, and collecting a certain number of physical prostrations. So then again, there's many, many, many other practices that are purification as well. But here we're talking about this one, Shakyamuni, visualization of Shakyamuni Buddha. So another factor which can increase or decrease the strength of a negative action has to do with its frequency. Actions that are done just once in our life don't have nearly the same impact as actions done repeatedly. Right? So if having done a negative action, we, as kind of indicated earlier, we sort of develop a certain pride towards it and say, oh, that was good. Maybe I can do even better next time, a better insult, a better harmful action, right? Then that just increases the strength of that negativity. But if after the action was completed and we think about it for a while, that certain sense of regret arises, then we might make a very strong determination. Well, I'm never going to do that again. That wasn't good. That was really bad. That was harmful. That was hurtful. I'm just never going to do that again. Right? So the presence of a decision not to repeat a harmful action greatly reduces the karmic consequences of those types of actions. And so that leads us, of course, well, that is in fact the fourth opponent power, the refraining or the restraint from engaging in those same actions in the future. Okay, so all four of these, whether it's regret, reliance, remedy, or restraint, all of these have direct bearing on how heavy a negative action is, or how we can reduce the heaviness of the action and make it much lighter, make its negative consequences much lighter for ourselves. So it's for those reasons, I believe, that when Kabje Zopa Rinpoche teaches about any practice of purification, he stresses the importance of the four opponent powers, because those attitudes, those four attitudes, are the ones that actually reduce the heaviness of a negative action. These practices aren't some kind of superficial magic. That if we say 100,000 mantras, then everything bad that we did, it suddenly disappears, or 100,000 prostrations, then that completely purifies any negativity we may have created. It's not magical thinking like that. It's the attitude with which we do these practices, which are directly related to what makes karma either heavy or light, that actually has the effect of purification. Okay. All right. I was thinking of continuing on a little bit before opening up for questions. And if there aren't any questions, I'll continue on. But if there's some burning question about what's been presented so far, I'd be happy to address it to the best of my ability. I have a question. Where's my watch? I don't know, I might have, oh yes, please. Stay.
Jon, so nice to see you again.
My pleasure.
So my question was on the opponent power of refuge. And it's something I have been trying to understand more deeply. And, I always remember His Holiness says, taking refuge is good, but it is the strength of your refuge that matters. And
Mm-hmm.
especially when obstacles come up, it's a strength of your refuge that helps you to deal with challenges in your life. And I've been
Mm-hmm.
trying to understand for myself, like, where does the strength of refuge come from? Like, how to deepen it in myself more than just at a superficial level.
Mm-hmm. That's probably a very, very big question, that a true Lama would be able to give a lot of detailed answer to. Um, I don't have that ability. But what occurs to me is the extent to which we see that the objects of refuge actually have ability, actually have power. The more we have faith in that, is the stronger our refuge is. For instance, for example, if we think that, Buddha was great, he lived. I think somebody's unmuted because there's maybe it's you, Snehi.
Yeah, sorry.
No, that's all right. It's just that it creates a kind of a thunder. Uh, um, no, I'm going to restart that answer again, thinking it over. What are the objects of refuge? I'll make these rhetorical questions so we don't have to go back and forth so much. So typically in Buddhism, the objects of refuge are Buddha, Dharma, and the Sangha, right? But when we delve into that more deeply, the actual object of refuge is the second one, is the Dharma, right? Buddha, of course, is an object of refuge because he taught the Dharma. Without his teachings, we wouldn't have access to it. The Sangha is an object of refuge because members of the Sangha help us practice the Dharma. But it's the practice of the Dharma itself which is the actual refuge. Right? So what does it mean to practice the Dharma? It means to be able, at least in part, it means to be able to discriminate between these actions which are beneficial and should be practiced, and those actions which are harmful and which should be avoided. It's the teachings of Dharma which allow us to make that discrimination. We use our discriminating wisdom to be able to discriminate between what's helpful and what's harmful based on the Dharma instructions that we receive, and then contemplating it, debating about it, asking questions about it, and then cultivating that recognition in meditation. So using those three wisdoms of hearing, thinking, and meditation, we generate deeper and deeper understanding that what the refuge of Dharma says is accurate, is true, is something that can be relied upon. Now, of course, there's a lot in the Dharma, but basically, I hope this is not too much of an oversimplification, but basically what the Dharma is saying, it's better to have a mind of an attitude of loving kindness, compassion, and wisdom than to follow any of the other minds that could arise, such as hatred, animosity, grasping, and so forth. That's how I believe, that's how we test whether the Dharma teachings are true or not. We go back in our life and we see what has been the result of acting with cruelty or stupidity or avarice or harm. What has those actions done to me in my life? Have they been helpful or not? Right. On the other hand, what happens when I try to soften the presence of those actions, try to refrain from them, and instead cultivate loving kindness, compassion, wisdom, and so forth? So when we ask questions like that, based on our own experience, we can come up with a faith that's not blind faith. It's not, oh, I believe it because Buddha said it, you know, or we're not even saying, I believe it because my teacher said it, you know. We're saying, I believe it because in my life, when I act one way, I'm happy, and when I act another way, me and other people around me are miserable. So obviously the Dharma teachings about what's effective and what's not effective is accurate. I don't have to do it in faith, based on faith of what someone else has said. I see it in my own experience. So though there may be many other more profound answers to your question, I think the way of deepening our refuge is to recognize that, first of all, the primary refuge is the Dharma that we, I'm missing the word, the Dharma that we take on board, right? The Dharma that we incorporate into our being, the Dharma that motivates our actions of body, speech, and mind, right? And we get more and more faith in those Dharma actions when we see their results, when we see how it is, in fact, you know, better to behave with loving kindness, compassion, and wisdom than with their opposites. And the more we see that, then of course, the easier it is to have faith in all three jewels: Buddha, the one who taught that, the Dharma itself, which is the teachings, and the Sangha, which helps us practice. Okay. Is that at all helpful?
John, your words are always so helpful. They land in my heart. Thank
That's right.
you.
That's very sweet of you. Yeah. Well, of course, if anything that comes out of this mouth is helpful, it's only because those are the things that went into these ears from listening to Lama Yeshe, Kepche Sopa Rinpoche, Geshe Ngawang Darge, and His Holiness the Dalai Lama, and other teachers that I've been fortunate to meet. Um, my my only task, which sometimes I do better than at other times, is just try to convey as best I can that which I've heard. If I had to rely on conveying that which I've deeply understood and incorporated, then there would be a great silence which would descend on this. Um, so better just to play the role of a messenger.
John, I have to say, I don't believe in the second part of your statement.
It's unfortunately very true.
No,
It's not.
no.
It's, well, but you're right. It can't be completely true because, like everyone else, I have the Buddha nature, right? So there's no pride behind that. It's not like I have the Buddha nature and someone else doesn't. It means we all have the Buddha nature. So, as the old joke goes, even a broken clock is right twice a day. Right? So even in an imperfect vehicle can convey things that are helpful, especially if that vehicle has been fortunate enough to have had exposure to the teachers that I've mentioned. Okay. I'm a little bit distracted at the moment because usually I have a clock here to help me know when to bring things to a close or when to move on to something else. But
it's about 12 o'clock. 12 o'clock our time, so 9 o'clock your time.
And we're going to 12:30 your time?
Yes.
So we have about a half an hour. Okay.
Yes.
If I get too close to 12:30 and don't stop, you can give me a high sign. All right. Okay. So maybe this is enough background to this purification practice. I don't feel too bad for having only gone over this much, even though we actually haven't touched on the practice itself yet, because as I've taken pains to point out, it is our understanding of these four opponent powers which give the purification practice their ability to actually affect a change in our lives. But now we can get into the details of the actual practice itself, and you have it's either appearing on your screen or you have a copy of that practice itself from this time or from a previous time. And it starts with a visualization, an initial visualization. And I've given two forms of it, two ways of doing it. I'm going to talk about them briefly in the opposite order from what they're on your sheet. On your sheet, the simplified version is given first, just 3 lines, and the elaborate visualization is given later, which is about 4 paragraphs. Okay, but in a certain way, the elaborate visualization is kind of easier to talk about initially, because basically we're bringing to mind the focal object of the practice, which is Guru Shakyamuni Buddha. And whether we have a picture or a statue of Buddha in front of us, or whether we have an image of the Buddha in our mind based on having seen so many pictures and statues in the past, it is this figure of a monk dressed in the robe, a teacher dressed in the robes of a monk, sitting in a cross-legged posture on a specially prepared seat. And then the details of the elaborate visualization are just mentioning what the different aspects of this visual aspect are present. Okay, what they look like, what his eyes, lips, hair, all of these things, what they look like. So there's no real need to mention them here. It's all written out, and it all corresponds to the image of Buddha that we are all familiar one way or the other. Okay. But there's one aspect of this picture of Buddha, this image we have of Buddha, that's particularly important, I feel, and that is that he is actually two aspects. One is that he is seated in the center of a sphere of light. In other words, you can imagine that from the heart of this figure, of the figure of Buddha, emanates a sphere of golden light, which then surrounds him like a halo. Okay, so what is this sphere of golden light? I've read accounts that in the lifetime of Buddha, there were many people who, when they saw Buddha, actually saw him in such a sphere. The same way that in Christian teachings, there are people at the time of Jesus who actually saw Jesus having a halo around his head. They actually saw him that way, right? But even for the people who didn't have the visual impression of Jesus with a halo or Buddha in this surrounding sphere of light, there's still a sense of these figures emanating their own qualities in the form of radiance, in the form of light. And I think we can relate to that if we've made contact with someone in our life. Preferably, one of the best cases, of course, would be a spiritual teacher that we've developed some kind of faith or devotion to, and that when we think of this teacher, we think of this man or woman, and we, especially when we imagine the expression on this teacher's face, it's as if, in that old saying, the eyes are the windows of the soul. Well, from the eyes of this teacher comes forth all of the qualities that we identify with the teacher: his or her compassion, her wisdom, her love, her skill, and so forth. All of this is coming out of their eyes, as it were, or by extension, coming out of all the pores of their body. In other words, this isn't necessarily something we have to see with our eyes. It's something that we feel with our hearts. It is, in fact, a heart radiance coming from this figure. Right? So when we visualize the Buddha, seeing him as in the center of the sphere of light simply means that he is emanating, he's manifesting all the qualities upon which our devotion or our faith in him are based. That he's looking at us, for example, in some of the descriptions, we visualize the Buddha as smiling at us, kind of a loving smile that accepts us just as we are. And you know what that feeling is like. You know the big difference between someone looking at us, kind of with a certain skepticism in their mind and saying, what kind of person are you? Why are you bothering me? As opposed to someone who, when we come in their presence, greet us as if we're our long lost friend, who are just ready to come to us with this attitude of acceptance and love and kindness. Many, many times I've heard the Dalai Lama say, and it's very evident when we see his behavior, that he views everyone that he meets as an old friend. He looks at them that way, He looks at them with the eyes of loving kindness. The same way that, when we haven't seen an old friend in a long time, we look at them with that. For those of you who weren't on this Zoom call right at the beginning, there are two people attending it that I haven't seen in many, many, many years, who I love so deeply in my heart. When I saw their pictures appear on these little rectangles, it was so heartwarming. It was as if that picture, that little rectangle in which their pictures are appearing, was actually glowing with this radiance, right? So where does it come from? It's not something one sees with the physical eye necessarily, but it's something we feel in the heart. So seeing the Guru Buddha as in the center of the sphere of light, and recognizing that that sphere is an expression of his loving kindness, compassion, wisdom, all those other good qualities, brings the visualization alive. So much so, and now this brings us back to the initial visualization, so much so that I've always felt, and I believe all the teachers that I've had kind of support this belief, but I don't want to foist it off on them in case there's something incomplete about it, that it would be better to have a feeling that the Buddha we're trying to visualize is unclear, out of focus, not able to see the details, but radiates. In other words, whatever we're bringing to mind has this radiant quality to it. It would be better to do that rather than to be able to see the Buddha in all his many details, as if it was a photograph of a statue, and yet feeling it was inert, having no quality, no pizzazz to it, no energy, right? It'd be better to focus on the qualities it's meant to represent rather than its simply accurate visual representation. Now, having said that, it's obviously the clearer that we can see it, the more accurate, the more like a living photograph or a hologram or whatever, the better it is. I'm not saying to try not to cultivate those qualities of being able to see it clearly. But of all of the aspects of the visualization, the most important is to see it as a living, breathing embodiment of the qualities of enlightenment itself. The same things that attract us to and allow us to cultivate a respect for our spiritual teachers. Okay, so that's That's why now I'm going to go back to the initial visualization. The initial visualizations is simply at the level of your forehead and approximately a body's length in front of you is a sphere of golden rainbow light shining with the inspiring radiance of the excellent qualities of your spiritual mentor and all fully enlightened beings, right? So in terms of the detail of visualization, there's almost no detail at all. It's just radiance. However you visualize radiance, however you feel radiance. Again, it's not necessarily something that comes to you through the doorway of your eyes. It's something that comes into your heart from the heart of another. Right? So, and one of the main reasons that I like starting with this for many people is that a lot of people claim that I can't visualize anything. And I think when people feel that, and I certainly have felt that, and certainly still do feel it to an extent, you know, it's because I feel that the visualization has to be picture perfect. Right? But the visualization doesn't have to be picture perfect as long as it conveys the qualities that we identify with enlightenment. If it shines with the radiance of love, of acceptance, of kindness, of wisdom, that's enough. That's enough. And so, and it's much easier just to feel that we're in the presence of radiance than presence of a being who looks this way and is dressed that way and has all these various attributes to it. So it's just with the intention of making it easier to get into it that I like presenting this simplified visualization to begin with. Once we're getting more and more used to visualizing the Buddha, then we can start with the detailed visualization right from the beginning. But if we do have, like so many people do have a problem with trying to visualize things with that kind of visual accuracy, then focusing on the underlying meaning of the radiance is the most important thing. And then, as with time, as we get more and more familiar with how Guru Shakyamuni Buddha can be visualized and how all the attributes that we visualize have meaning behind it, then we can just visualize Buddha as inhabiting this sphere of light that we've already been able to focus on. Okay? All right. So I'm not going to go through the detail of the initial visualization. We all have access to it. And as I said, it is merely a description of how Shakyamuni Buddha is generally visualized in this particular posture. Actually, I had started talking about this by saying that there was two important qualities with visualization, and I mentioned one being the radiance. The other is actually revealed right in the very name of the central figure. You'll notice in this practice, he's not called Shakyamuni Buddha, he's called Guru Shakyamuni Buddha. And this has a lot of meaning behind it, because if we, one of the most powerful ways of being able to relate to the Dharma as a real refuge and Buddha as an offering of refuge is to see the Buddha as like our personal guru. You know, not someone who lived such a long time ago, who's an historical figure, but someone whose influence is still alive, still very, very much alive nowadays, and is coming to us primarily through the medium of our personal teacher. Now, this is, I'm assuming, which is not true for everyone here necessarily, that we've established a connection with someone that we, or maybe even more than one teacher that we recognize as being a guru to us, not just a teacher, not just a professor, but someone who embodies and transmits the kind of qualities that we wish to cultivate. So we're seeing Buddha and the guru, in this sense, as merged, as identical, as one manifesting the other. There's a saying that I remember hearing when I was a relatively new student that was talked about the qualities of the guru, the one that we recognize as having this very beneficial effect on our life, on our mind. And they said the Buddha is like the sunshine. The guru is like the magnifying glass that focuses the rays of the sunlight so realizations burst into flames in our own heart. I used to love doing that as a kid. I'd take a magnifying glass, go out in the sun, and then set, a leaf or something on fire by focusing the rays, right? So the guru is the focusing agent that focuses the inspiring rays coming from the Buddha so that realizations arise in our own heart. And so we identify this figure that we're visualizing not as simply as a historical figure, someone from the past, someone outside our direct experience, but as embodied in this relationship that we have, if we have such a relationship with our spiritual mentor. Okay. So that description ends with, feel that the supremely compassionate, fully enlightened being, the one we're visualizing in front of us, is free of all critical judgments, and that he accepts you lovingly, just as you are, recognizing your fundamental Buddha nature. Okay. Now, it doesn't take long. It takes me long because I'm very long-winded, but it doesn't take us long to go through a description like that. But it could take quite a lot of practice until the meaning of all of those words are something that we can wrap our mind around, so that when we say them or read them, it actually brings up an experience in us. One of the extraordinary values, one of the delicious qualities of making contact with a teacher who causes a profound turning around in the seat of our consciousness is now we can relate to receiving that kind of inspiration. Once we receive it through one person, we can relate to how all the meditational deities, all the Buddhas, all the holy beings, we can relate to them through that same porthole, that heart-to-heart connection that may have come into existence first by having met the teacher who has touched us so deeply. Okay. I still haven't located the watch, so maybe I need a time check. I don't want to keep you here until next week.
12:17.
So
About
you have,
20 after 12.
Great, thank you. I appreciate that.
You're welcome.
Okay, we can do a little bit more. So after the initial visualization, either the elaborate or the simplified one, we cultivate the first quality, the power of regret. Actually, that power of regret may be cultivated even before we sat down to do the meditation. In other words, when we ask ourselves, why am I doing this meditation? Why am I purifying? It may be because we've remembered something that needs purification, right? So the power of regret. So we begin by recalling harmful actions that you may have committed with your body, speech, and mind. recognizing that these destructive actions, which currently obscure your Buddha nature, are the source of every suffering. Cultivate the sincere feeling of regret that motivates you to cleanse yourself of all of their unwanted consequences. So I think that by this point, I think that's probably doesn't need too much more commentary. I think that's clear. Okay. So then the second power, the power of reliance, has two parts to it, taking refuge and generating bodhicitta. Now, I believe I mentioned this last time, why the power of reliance has these two aspects, taking refuge and generating bodhicitta. But if I didn't, or if it's not obvious to our memory at this point, the power of reliance, we're relying on what actually were the objects that we I'll use the word harmed, but with a kind of a question mark. What were the objects that we harmed by our negative action? In other words, the action that we are regretting harmed something, right? What were those actions? Now, often we would give a very superficial answer to the question, like if the negative action was, insulting somebody, right? Then the action was the insult, and the object that received that insult was the other person. Okay, that seems quite straightforward. But in terms of this purification practice, that is not the object of our negative action. Sure, the other person was the person that we insulted, but what we actually harmed was our own refuge in the teachings of the Buddha and our own compassionate bodhicitta motivation to help others. That's what actually was hurt. Sure, the other person's feeling might be hurt to some extent, but the reason that's significant is because if we're doing this practice, it means that to some extent or another, we're in the business of trying to help others, not hurt others. So when we do hurt others, instead of helping them, more profound than whatever harm we give to that individual person is the weakening of our own refuge and bodhicitta. Because if our refuge was particularly strong, if we really kept in mind how incorrect it is to harm others and how important it is to help them, and if our bodhicitta was really strong, and we realized our actions should be aimed at benefiting others, not in harming them in any way, then we never would have engaged in those negative actions, certainly not knowingly, right? Not intentionally. So when we harm another being, we're weakening our bodhicitta motivation. And also, it is possible that our negative actions can harm our refuge in other ways. For instance, one of the commitments from having taken refuge in the Three Jewels is to take care of whatever images we might have of the Buddha, for example, pictures or statues. So we're meant to keep them on a clean, high place, present offerings and so forth, and not leave them on the floor or sit on them or knock them over, and that commitment is not because if we allow dust to collect on a Buddha statue, the Buddha statue is going to be upset with us. It's not that. Again, we're not talking about magical thinking here. We're talking about we take the image of the Buddha and put it in a high, clean place as a sign of the respect we have for the understanding of what the Buddha gives us, and therefore wanting to treat it respectfully. So disrespect to this statue, in a way, is against our refuge vow to show respect for anything that represents the three jewels. So in our lifetime, we can either kind of, let's say, quote unquote, insult or harm the three jewels, like by showing disrespect to a Buddha statue, and in other ways. Or I would think the vast majority of the negative actions we do are towards other beings that we share this planet with, when we're not relating to them in terms of loving kindness and compassion and skill, but instead are being harmful. So that's why it said that the actual objects that we have to rely on are our own refuge and bodhicitta, our own cultivation of these positive states of mind, because these are what were diminished by the negative action. So these are what we must rely on to resuscitate the actions and make them positive. And our teachers often give us this example that if you were walking along and you trip and you fall down onto the ground, how do you get up again? By pushing off against the ground. In other words, you rely on that which you fell on to help you stand up again. Does that make sense? That visual image, pushing yourself off the ground. So here, since what our negative actions have done was either weakened our refuge or our bodhicitta motivation, or both of them, right? Then we rely on our refuge and bodhicitta to get back up again. And so that's present in the two parts of section 2. The power of reliance, the first section is taking refuge, and the second section is the power of reliance generating bodhicitta. So I'm just going to read this, and then that can be the basis for what we focus on between now and the next week. So imagine yourself seated in the center of a vast assembly of mother sentient beings, all of whom wish to be happy and to be separated from suffering, just as you yourself do. Now, this idea of imagining yourself in a center of a vast assembly, it actually is true. Every direction we look around us, from the center point that we exist at, all around us are other beings, and all of them wish to be happy. So we actually are in the center of an assembly like that. Whether they're organized as a sphere surrounding us, that's another question. But they do surround us in all directions, and like ourselves, wish to be happy. Feeling the enlightened presence of the Guru Buddha before you, and recalling his excellent qualities and his readiness and ability to help, take heartfelt refuge in him as the embodiment of the three jewels. From the depths of your heart, request the Guru Buddha's inspiration to become free from every limitation, so that you may gain all the realizations along the path to full enlightenment. In such a state of mind, go for refuge 3 times. And underneath that, I've put the Refuge Formula in both Sanskrit and in English. People who know it in Tibetan could also do it in Tibetan. And also, in place of this, in fact, in place of both parts A and B, one could also recite the prayer that we started with this morning. That also serves as a refuge and bodhicitta prayer. remember, we said Lama Sangye Lama Cha Deshin Lama Gedun Te Gunki Chepo Lama Te Lama Namla Chuba Po. We're recognizing the Guru as the embodiment of the three jewels of refuge, and we're taking refuge in him for the sake of benefiting all beings. So there are many different prayers that are possible for generating refuge in bodhicitta. And that one that I just recited, that we recited at the beginning of the session, is one of them. And then there's the refuge formula itself, which is here under 2a. Namo Gurubhya, Namo Buddhaya, Namo Dharmaya, Namo Sangaya. And a lot of times, if we have the time and the energy, we can actually chant those lines repeatedly and get the value of all of the verbal recitation. And next week we can try that as well to give an idea of how this can be chanted in a very powerful way. And then 2b, or not to be, the power of reliance generating bodhicitta. Then cultivate the compassionate bodhicitta motivation as you recite the following 3 times. And the following is the prayer that is recited at the beginning of every teaching session. I go for refuge until I'm enlightened to the Buddhas, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly. By the virtuous merit that I collect by practicing giving and other perfections, may I attain the state of a Buddha in order to benefit all sentient beings. And again, that's something that could be just simply recited the way I did, or it can be sung or chanted, giving us a chance to really get into the feeling of it more. Especially when we do it in a group, this can be very, very powerful. And then this section ends, it says, finally, to enhance your bodhicitta motivation, cultivate the 4 immeasurables of equanimity, love, compassion, and joy as follows. And these are the wishes which give rise to the bodhicitta motivation. I go, may all sentient beings be free from the bias of attachment and aversion. That's equanimity. May all sentient beings have happiness and the causes of happiness. That's loving kindness. May all sentient beings be free from suffering and the causes of suffering. That's compassion. And may all sentient beings find fortunate rebirths and complete liberation. And this is joy. And again, these verses can be recited and amplified, and again, in whichever way most effectively conveys these feelings to our minds. Okay, so I think that's going to be enough for today. My suggestion is try to become familiar with what's been presented so far, and then and gather any questions you might have about it. And I believe you all have or have access to my email address. So between now and next week, if there's any questions or comments that come up, especially things that you'd like me to direct our class next Friday to, if you send me an email, that will be extremely helpful to help me focus on what would be most beneficial here. So you can use, if you don't have my email address, I think you have it, but if you don't, you can get it from Shantideva. And and then as preparation for next week, spend some time looking at the power of remedy, the 3rd section, because this is the main part in terms of time. It's the main part of the purification practice. it has to do with the recitation and visualization of the mantra and the actual purification visualization that goes along with that. Okay, so if you're familiarized with yourself with that, that would be very, very helpful for next time. That'll be our main focus next time. Okay, so I think now, unless there's a question, if there is a question, then I could address now before we go. All right, so now we can end this session. You know, we always start by any session, or actually any activity, any significant activity, we start with cultivating the as altruistic a motivation as we can. And then when that action comes to an end, then we dedicate whatever positive energy has been generated by it. And those of us who are students of Gebje Lama Zopa Rinpoche know that these dedications can be extremely extensive and extremely detailed, and for very, very good reasons, since this is so vitally important. But there is a commonly recited prayer that conveys this dedication. So, due to this virtue, may I quickly become a Guru Buddha and lead all transmigratory beings without exception to that state. And then we can practice just doing that once in Tibetan. Gewandi Nyunduna Lama Sangye Drum Yone Droa Chikyang Malu Dehi Sala Gomba Sho. Thank you very, very much. And I look forward to hearing any questions or comments you might have on this ensuing week, and then seeing you again on Friday. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jon.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, Jon.
Thank you.